There are nights that arrive without warning, quiet on the outside, but heavy within. This was one of those nights. Nothing seemed different at first. The world moved as it always had. Voices came and went, distant and unclear. But inside, something had begun to sink. Slowly, almost gently, like a weight settling where it had no place to be. He sat with it for a while, not fully understanding. Was it tiredness? Was it disappointment? Or something deeper that had been waiting unnoticed for too long? Sometimes it is not one moment that breaks a person, but many small ones stacked silently on top of each other. Words left unsaid, feelings pushed aside. Times he chose silence, not because he wanted to, but because it felt easier than being misunderstood. And so he carried them, quietly, without complaint. But that night, they felt heavier than before. The room around him was still, almost too still, as if the silence itself was asking a question he could no longer avoid. How long can someone keep holding everything inside before it begins to slip? He didn't have an answer. He thought about the times he had tried to explain himself, the moments he had opened his heart, only to feel unheard, or worse, misjudged. They saw his quietness and gave it their own meaning. They filled the gaps with assumptions, never asking what truly lived beneath the surface. And each time, he stepped back a little more, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. It becomes tiring, doesn't it? To repeat yourself, to defend feelings that were never meant to be questioned, to prove a truth that should have been felt, not argued. So he stopped trying. At first, it felt like relief, a kind of protection. If he said less, there would be less to misunderstand. If he stayed quiet, there would be nothing to twist or turn against him. But silence, when it is forced, has a different kind of weight. It builds slowly. It sits in the chest. It lingers in the spaces between thoughts. And over time, it begins to ask something in return. What are you holding back, and why? That night, those questions felt closer than ever. He looked around, but there was no one to answer them. Only the quiet walls and the steady sound of his own breathing. It was strange. How loud silence could become when there was nowhere left to hide from it. For a moment, just a moment, he wondered if it would be easier to let everything go, to stop holding on, to stop trying, to stop caring, to stop caring. The thought came softly, almost like a whisper. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just a quiet suggestion, slipping into the space where hope had grown tired. Have you ever felt that? Not a loud urge to give up, but a quiet one that feels almost reasonable. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply sat there feeling the weight of that thought, unsure whether to resist it or let it stay. Because sometimes the hardest battles are not the ones we fight with others, but the ones that unfold in complete silence, where no one sees and no one knows. This was one of those battles, and in that stillness, something important was about to be decided. Though he did not yet realize it, the night held its breath, and so did he. They had already decided what his silence meant. It did not matter that they never asked. It did not matter that they never waited long enough to understand. In their eyes, quietness became something small, something uncertain, something easy to overlook. And perhaps, at first, he tried to correct them. There were moments when he almost spoke, when words rose to the surface, ready to explain what he truly felt. But something always held him back. Not fear exactly, but a quiet knowing. A sense that even if he spoke, they might not really hear. Have you ever felt that when the effort to explain feels heavier than the silence itself? So he remained still. They took that stillness and shaped it into their own story. They saw distance where there was depth. They saw weakness where there was restraint. They saw indifference where there was simply a tired heart, choosing not to argue anymore. And slowly those misunderstandings began to settle around him, like a quiet fog. He could feel it. Each look that lingered too long. Each word that carried an edge he could not ignore. Each moment where he was seen, but not truly understood. It is a strange feeling to be present, yet unseen in the ways that matter. He noticed how easy it was for them to fill silence with assumptions, how quickly they reached conclusions without ever stepping closer. It was as if his quietness invited them to decide who he was, without ever asking who he had become. At times, it stirred something within him, a quiet tension, a question that pressed gently against his thoughts. Should I say something this time? Should he finally speak, explain, correct what they had misunderstood? The urge would rise, slowly, like a wave building beneath the surface. Words would begin to form, carrying truth, carrying feeling, carrying everything he had kept inside for so long. But just as quickly, the wave would fall, because deep down, he remembered. He remembered the times he had tried before. The way his words were met with impatience or twisted into something they were never meant to be. He remembered how exhausting it felt to open up only to be left feeling even more alone than before. And so, he chose silence again, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had said enough in ways they never cared to understand. Still, the weight of it remained. There is a quiet discomfort in holding back what feels true. A subtle pressure that does not shout, but lingers. It rests in the chest, in the pauses between breaths, in the spaces where words were meant to be. And sometimes it makes you wonder, am I becoming invisible, or am I simply becoming distant? The line between the two can feel unclear. They continued as they always had, unaware of the quiet struggle unfolding within him. Their voices carried on, unchanged, untouched by the silence they had helped create. But inside, something was shifting. The tension was shifting. The tension was no longer just about being misunderstood. It was becoming something deeper, something more personal. It was about the choice he was making each time he remained silent. Was it strength, or was it surrender? He could not answer that yet. All he knew was that reacting felt wrong, but staying silent did not feel easy either. And so, he sat between the two, caught in that quiet space where nothing is spoken, yet everything is felt. The night stretched on, patient and still. And within that stillness, his silence began to change, though he had not yet found the words to understand how. At some point, the struggle within him began to quiet. Not because the world around him had changed, but because something inside him had started to see more clearly. The noise that once stirred his thoughts, the urge to respond, to correct, to defend, it slowly began to lose its hold. He noticed it in small moments first. A word spoken carelessly, that once would have lingered in his mind for hours, now passed through him more gently. A look that once felt heavy with meaning, now seemed lighter, almost distant. It was not that he no longer felt anything. It was that he was beginning to understand something he had missed before. Not every voice carries truth. Not every opinion deserves a response. This realization did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, like the slow turning of a page he had read too many times. And as it settled within him, something loosened, something that had been held too tightly for too long. He began to see that his silence was not empty. It was space. Space where he could choose what mattered and what did not. Space where he no longer had to carry every word that reached him. Space where he could remain steady, even when others were not. Have you ever felt that shift when you realize you do not have to answer everything? At first, it can feel unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if you are stepping away from something you have always done without question. But then there is a quiet relief. He no longer felt the same pull to explain himself, the need to be understood by everyone, to be seen correctly in every moment. It began to fade. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was unimportant, but because he was beginning to see its limits. There are some who will not understand, no matter how carefully you speak. Some who will see only what they have already decided to see. And in that truth, there is a kind of freedom. He sat with that thought for a long time. What if silence was not something he had to endure, but something he could choose? What if it was not a sign of weakness, but a form of quiet control? The idea settled slowly, but firmly. He realized that every time he had held back his reaction, every time he had chosen not to respond in anger or frustration, he had been protecting something. Not his image, not his pride, but his peace. And peace, he began to understand, is not something easily regained once lost. So he watched more closely now. He listened, not to respond, but to understand. He observed the way words moved through others, the way emotions rose and fell without warning. And in doing so, he noticed something simple, yet powerful. Much of what once troubled him was never truly his to carry. It belonged to them. Their assumptions, their impatience, their need to fill silence with noise. He had taken it in unknowingly, believing he needed to answer it, to fix it, to make it right. But now he saw it differently. He could let it pass. And in that letting go, his silence began to feel lighter. It was no longer a burden pressing against him. It became something steady, something grounded. a quiet place he could return to, no matter what unfolded around him. The tension that once lived within him began to soften. He no longer sat between reaction and restraint, unsure of which to choose. The answer, though simple, felt stronger than before. He would not respond to everything. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer needed to say it. And in that choice, something within him grew quieter, but also stronger. A different kind of strength, one that did not need to be seen or proven. The night remained still. But this time, his silence felt different. It was no longer filled with questions. It was beginning to hold answers. By the time the night began to fade, something within him had already changed. It was not loud. There was no sudden feeling of victory, no moment where everything became clear all at once. Instead, it was quiet, steady, like a deep breath taken after holding it for too long. He sat there, noticing the stillness around him, but also the stillness within. The thoughts that once circled endlessly had begun to settle. The need to go back over every word, every moment, every misunderstanding, it no longer held the same weight. For the first time in a long while, he was not trying to fix anything. He was simply there. There is a kind of peace that comes when you stop reaching outward for answers and begin to rest within yourself. It does not arrive with force. It does not demand attention. It just appears quietly when there is nothing left to resist. He felt that now. The voices that once seemed so important, the opinions that once pressed against his mind, they had grown distant. Not because they had disappeared, but because he was no longer holding on to them. And in that space, something stronger had taken their place. A quiet understanding. He no longer needed to prove who he was. He no longer felt the pull to correct every misunderstanding or to chase after clarity in the eyes of others. Some things, he realized, are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be lived, quietly, without defense. Have you ever reached that point where being understood by everyone no longer feels necessary? It can feel unfamiliar at first, almost as if something important has been set down, something you carried for so long. You forgot what it felt like to be without it. But then there is a lightness. He noticed it in the way he breathed, in the way his shoulders no longer held the same tension. Even in silence, there was no pressure now, no quiet demand asking him to speak, to act, to respond. There was only calm. They would still think what they wanted. They would still see him through their own understanding, shaped by things he could not control. But for the first time, that no longer disturbed him, because his sense of self was no longer resting in their hands. It had returned to him. Gently, without struggle, he had taken it back, and with it came a different kind of strength. Not the kind that argues or proves, not the kind that seeks to be seen, but the kind that remains steady even when nothing around it is certain. It was quiet strength, the kind that does not need recognition, the kind that cannot be shaken by words or touched by misunderstanding. He did not feel the need to show it. He sighed. Millply felt it, resting within him, calm and unmoving. The night, which had once felt heavy and endless, now seemed softer, as if it had carried him through something unseen, and now, gently, it was letting him rest. There was nothing left to decide, no final answer to reach, only a quiet knowing that he would carry this silence differently from now on, not as something forced upon him, but as something he could choose, again and again, a place of return, a place where he remained whole, no matter what was said or left unsaid. And as the darkness slowly gave way, he did not rush to move or to change anything around him. He simply sat, present, steady, at peace with what he had found. Sometimes, the strongest turning points in life do not arrive with noise. They come like this, in silence, in stillness, in a moment no one else will ever see. And yet, they change everything.